The iconic girl who loved too deeply, the tragic end of Jane Birkin. Jane Birkin was born in London, became one of France's most cherished women, lent her name to the most famous handbag on earth, and spent decades turning fragility into beauty in full view of the public. To many people, she was a voice, a face, a fringe, an accent, a song too scandalous for polite company, and a name stitched into luxury leather. But those are only the easy details, the details history likes, because they fit neatly into headlines. The harder truth is that Jane Birkin's life was shaped not only by charm and fame, but by longing, by loyalty, by grief, and by the peculiar cost of loving people who could never be kept. By the time she died in Paris in July 2023 at the age of 76, France had not simply lost a celebrity. It had lost someone who had across decades become woven into its emotional landscape. And to understand why her death felt like the end of an era, you have to go back to the beginning, to the shy English girl who did not yet know that the country she would one day belong to was waiting across the channel. Jane Mallory Birkin was born in London in December 1946 into a family where discipline and art lived side by side. Her father, David Birkin, was a Royal Navy commander, a man shaped by service, secrecy, and wartime seriousness. Her mother, Judy Campbell, was something very different, a celebrated actress, elegant and theatrical, with deep roots in the British stage world. Between them, Jane inherited two contrary legacies. From one side came restraint, duty, and the sense that life could contain hidden burdens. From the other came performance, imagination, and the knowledge that a room could be transformed by presence alone. Her household was cultured, comfortable, and creatively alive. Her siblings would also move toward artistic lives. It was the sort of family in which talent was not considered exotic, only expected to take some form eventually. And yet the child at the center of it all was not born with the certainty one might imagine. Jane was not the loudest person in the room. She was not someone who arrived already convinced of her own importance. The mythology would come later. At the beginning, there was just a girl from London, sensitive and observant, quietly absorbing the contrast between glamour and gravity that would define so much of her adult life. What made Jane memorable, even before fame, was that she seemed to stand at an angle to the conventional ideals around her. She had that androgynous, coltish look that the late 60s would eventually turn into style, but youth rarely feels fashionable when you are living through it. Long before the world decided she was iconic, she had to grow into a face and body that did not fit the easiest definitions of feminine beauty. That may be one reason there was always something vulnerable beneath her poise. Even when she became a symbol of effortless chic, there remained in her manner an almost apologetic softness, as though part of her still suspected that she had arrived there by accident. And yet she was surrounded early by the machinery of performance. Theatre was not abstract in her home, it was a real thing, a profession, a calling. Watching her mother's world, Jane learned that identity could be made, remade, costumed, lit, and offered to an audience. She also learned, perhaps without quite realizing it, that public grace and private uncertainty can exist in the same person at the same time. That doubleness would stay with her for the rest of her life. Jane first stepped onto the stage as a teenager. By 17, she was already acting, drawn toward performance not as rebellion, but as a natural extension of the world she had grown up inside. In 1965, she appeared in the musical Passion Flower Hotel, a production connected to the composer John Barry, already famous for his work on the James Bond films. Barry was older, established, and successful. Jane was still barely out of girlhood. They married soon afterward, and in 1967 their daughter Kate was born. It looked from the outside like a swift and glittering beginning. The young actress, the celebrated composer, the beautiful child, the promise of a modern life in the center of the swinging 60s. But some lives reveal their fracture lines early. The marriage did not hold. By the late 1960s it had ended, leaving Jane still very young, already a mother, and already familiar with the feeling that the life you thought you were entering can close behind you before it has properly begun. There is something haunting about that stage of her story, not because it was dramatic in the tabloid sense, but because it established a pattern that would recur again and again. Love would open doors for Jane Birkin. It would also wound her. Before France claimed her, Jane passed through one of the definitive cultural moments of 60s London. In 1966, she appeared in Michelangelo Antonioni's Blow Up, a film whose cool surfaces, sexual provocation, and existential emptiness captured something essential about that era. Her role was brief, but memorable enough to attach her to the mood of the time. Beautiful young people drifting through a city that seemed to believe style might save it from meaninglessness. Blow Up became notorious in part for its nudity and erotic charge, and Birkin's appearance in it gave her early visibility. But visibility is not the same thing as arrival. At that moment she was known without yet being established, seen without yet being secure. She was a young English actress with a failed marriage behind her, an infant daughter to care for, and no fixed future ahead. The world she moved through was glamorous. Yes, but glamour can be one of the loneliest places to stand if you are not yet certain who you are. What came next would look in retrospect like destiny. At the time it was closer to improvisation, the kind of decision people make when they are trying not to drown. In 1969, Jane Birkin went to Paris to appear in a French film called Slogan. It is one of those moments in a life story that later acquires the glow of inevitability, even though almost nothing about it was inevitable at all. She was English, young, freshly bruised by a broken marriage, and entering a country that had not yet become home. The film itself is not what lasted. What lasted was the man waiting on the other side of it. Her co-star was Serge Gainsbourg, already notorious, already gifted, already difficult. If Birkin seemed all openness and fragility, Gainsbourg represented something more dangerous, brilliance sharpened by self-loathing, charm complicated by provocation, tenderness forever, at risk of curdling into contempt. France had seen many performers, many beautiful women, many artistic scandals, but when Jane Birkin and Serge Gainsbourg entered each other's lives, they created a mythology that neither of them would ever fully escape. Reauthors later described how they met on the set of Slogan and quickly began a love affair that captivated the country. That phrase, captivated the country, matters. This was not just romance. It became national theatre. There was an immediate contrast between them that people found impossible to resist. He was older by nearly 2 decades, brilliantly verbal, unkempt, self-consciously ugly, and already famous for turning provocation into art. She was luminous, accented, young, and newly arrived, the embodiment of that London gammon style the French found irresistible. Together they seemed to stage a fantasy that was partly romantic and partly symbolic, the tormented French genius and the tender English ingenue. But pairings like that are always deceptive. They flatten real people into roles the public wants them to play. Jane became very quickly not just Serge's partner, but Serge's muse. And muse is one of those words that sounds flattering until you realize how much it asks a woman to disappear inside somebody else's imagination. Birkin would spend years pushing against that reduction. Even in the beginning, when love was still incandescent, there was already the risk that she would be adored more as an image than understood as a person. Then came the song. In 1969, Serge Gainsbourg and Jane Birkin released Je t'aime moi non plus, and almost overnight the record became one of the most infamous pop songs in Europe. It was explicit without pretending not to be. It was breathy, intimate, provocative, and impossible to confuse with innocence. The BBC banned it. The Vatican condemned it. Several countries restricted it, which of course only made it larger. Scandal has always understood the mathematics of attention. Outrage multiplies reach. The song went to #1 in Britain anyway, and Birkin's voice, fragile, erotic, airy, unmistakably hers, was suddenly attached to an international sensation. For many artists, a single hit secures a career. For Jane Birkin, this one also locked a certain persona around her. The world now knew her as the girl in that song, the whispering accomplice to French decadence, the beautiful foreign woman at the center of a continental uproar. It made her famous. It also made her easier to misread. The fascinating thing about Jane Birkin's fame is that her supposed lightness concealed how much endurance it required. People saw the style, the bangs, the basket, the accent, the songs with Serge, the photographs that looked effortless because she had made effort disappear from them. But effortless women are often women. The world has decided not to look at too closely. Birkin's early celebrity in France rested on qualities that seemed charming and manageable. Her Englishness, her slim frame, her disarming softness, her willingness to sing in a voice that sounded almost transparent. Yet this same softness made her easy to frame as a surface, a fantasy, an accessory to a greater male genius. It is to her credit that she did not stay there. In the years that followed, she would insist, not always loudly, but unmistakably, on becoming larger than the role assigned to her. The irony is that what made her unforgettable in the first place was not the erotic scandal. It was the humanity that kept leaking out through it. The 1970s gave Jane Birkin both her most mythologized romance and the slow construction of a real career. She and Gainsbourg became one of Europe's great cultural pairings, the sort of couple whose apartment, arguments, records, clothes, and children all seemed to belong partly to public imagination. In 1971, their daughter Charlotte Gainsbourg was born, binding them together beyond music and beyond scandal. At the same time, Jane was building a substantial life in French cinema. The year of slogan, she also appeared in La Piscine, and throughout the decade she worked steadily, balancing popular comedy with more serious, riskier projects. French audiences embraced her not just as Serge's companion, but as a household presence in her own right. That mattered. It meant she was becoming rooted in France through work, not simply through romance. Her accent, instead of holding her at a distance, became part of her appeal. She was not fully French, and never pretended to be. But she was no longer merely passing through. That distinction is essential, because celebrity couples have a way of swallowing the individual identities of the people inside them. Birkin resisted that swallowing by continuing to work, film after film, stage appearance after stage appearance, song after song. The public may have first seen her through Serge's eyes, but she kept creating spaces where she could be encountered without him. It is one of the quieter achievements of her life that she managed, over time, to shift from symbol to artist without ever losing the public affection that first attached to the symbol. Yet the relationship at the center of those years was not simply romantic, and certainly not easy. Readers noted that Gainsbourg's drinking ultimately overwhelmed the relationship. That is a restrained phrase for a familiar tragedy. The brilliant man, the woman who loves him, the chaos that first looks bohemian and then reveals itself as damage. By the time the outside world caught up to how untenable it had become, Jane had already spent years living inside it. It is tempting, especially in retrospect, to romanticize a relationship like theirs. The photographs invite it, the songs encourage it, the legend practically demands it, but legends are made by removing the exhausting parts. Living with a man like Serge Gainsbourg meant living beside genius and self-destruction at once. It meant participating in one of the most electrifying artistic partnerships of the era, while also absorbing the instability that partnership produced. Birkin loved him deeply. That much was clear, not only during their years together but long after the relationship ended. And love of that kind is rarely simple. It keeps trying to remember the tenderness, even after the tenderness has become irregular. It stays loyal to moments that no longer define the whole. It confuses emotional truth with the hope that what once existed can be restored. For 12 years, Birkin and Gainsbourg inhabited that contradiction. They made art, made news, made a daughter, made a world around themselves. But a world built around a drinker eventually begins to orbit the drink instead. When Jane left Serge in 1981, it was not because the love had vanished. It was because love alone had stopped being enough to save what they were inside. This is one of the saddest truths in her story, and one of the most adult. Some relationships do not end from indifference. They end from accumulation. Too much volatility, too much pain, too many years spent negotiating around someone else's appetites. Rita's records that after their breakup she went on to live with the filmmaker Jacques Doyon, with whom she had another daughter, Lou Doyon, born in 1982, but it also records something else. She remained close to Gainsbourg until his death in 1991. That detail says everything. Jane Birkin was not a woman who loved cleanly and moved on. She remained attached to the people who marked her, even when it would have been emotionally easier not to. That perhaps is why the title fits her so well. She loved too deeply, not foolishly, not theatrically, but with a kind of fidelity that kept people present inside her long after circumstances had changed. The remarkable thing about Jane Birkin's life after Serge is how fully it disproves the idea that she was only ever his creation. Once outside the formal relationship, she did not fade. She expanded. She continued to sing, continued to act, and crucially, continued to choose collaborators who sharpened rather than diminished her. BFI notes that she worked with filmmakers such as Jacques Doyon, Jacques Rivette, Jean-Luc Godard, Alain Resnais, and Agnès Varda, whose Jane B. by Agnès Varda remains one of the most intriguing meditations on Birkin, as both person and image. These were not decorative assignments. They were the projects of a woman taking her own artistic life seriously. She also kept performing music that connected her to Gainsbourg while refusing to be trapped in nostalgia. That balance was difficult and distinctly hers. She neither disowned the past nor allowed it to become the whole of her identity. She treated memory as material, alive, painful, necessary, and still available for transformation. This period is where the deeper version of Jane Birkin comes into focus, not the icon of a single era, but the working artist who kept evolving long after the public had fixed on one version of her. She won audiences on stage through warmth rather than intimidation. She toured, she recorded, she aged publicly without armoring herself in distance. That last quality matters more than it first appears to. Many famous people survive by becoming unreadable. Birkin did something riskier. She remained legible. Even in later life, she still projected openness, humor, a slight disorderliness, a sense that a human being had walked into the room rather than a brand. It is one reason France loved her so intensely. She became, over time, not merely admired but familiar. She was the Englishwoman who had chosen France and then spent the rest of her life giving something of herself back to it. And then, almost absurdly, there is the handbag. In the early 1980s, during a flight, Birkin spilled the contents of her bag and found herself in conversation with Jean-Louis Dumas of Hermès. In Jane's own later recollection, she complained that there was no proper bag with pockets, nothing practical enough for the life she was actually living. Dumas invited her to describe it, and she sketched the idea on an aeroplane sick bag, something bigger than a Kelly but smaller than a suitcase. He had it made, and the Birkin bag was born. This origin story has become fashion folklore because it contains everything luxury branding loves: chance encounter, impeccable pedigree, a beautiful woman, and the alchemy of turning inconvenience into exclusivity. But the story is even more striking when you notice what Birkin herself wanted from the object. Not mystique, not status, usefulness. She wanted a bag that worked. It was practicality, not aspiration, that produced one of the most aspirational objects in the modern world. That contradiction would follow her for the rest of her life. The Birkin bag became a global symbol of luxury, exclusivity, waiting lists, resale values, and a kind of wealth that wants to be recognized by those already fluent in its codes. Jane herself, meanwhile, continued to move through the world with a kind of unfussy disarray that made all of that seem faintly comic. Vogue recalled her dry humor about the fact that people increasingly recognized her name through the bag rather than through her work. She joked that now the bag would sing. The joke is funny because it carries the truth inside it. Birkin understood that fame creates distortions, and few distortions are stranger than becoming secondary to an object named after you. She accepted the absurdity without ever becoming entirely comfortable with it. In 2015, according to Smithsonian's account, she even asked for her name to be removed from crocodile skin versions over concerns about animal treatment. It was a small but telling act, proof that she was still trying to insist on conscience in the middle of commerce. What distinguished Jane Birkin from many icons of her generation is that she refused, gently but firmly, to remain decorative. Reuters noted that in France she became beloved not only for her songs and film roles, but also for her steady support of women's rights and LGBT rights. BFI adds that she campaigned for abortion rights, protested policies targeting undocumented migrants, and spoke out against the far right. This is important because style can often sanitize a person, flattening them into posture and wardrobe. Birkin's image was so endlessly reproduced that it would have been easy for the moral core of her life to disappear behind it. But she kept returning, publicly, to what mattered beyond herself. She used her visibility for causes that were not always convenient, and not always glamorous. That, too, is part of the answer to why France mourned her the way it did. She was not simply admired from a distance. She had taken positions, spoken out, and attached herself to the country's moral arguments as well as its cultural life. And yet the most affecting thing about her activism is that it felt consistent with her temperament. Jane Birkin did not campaign like someone trying to rebrand herself as serious. She simply seemed unable to be entirely indifferent. Even her style, the basket bag, the jeans, the sweater, the sense of being barely arranged, carried a quiet resistance to ornamental femininity as a cage. She could be photographed endlessly and still somehow appear not to have posed for the idea of herself. That quality gave her unusual credibility. People believed she meant what she said because she never looked as though she had said it to improve her image. If anything, she seemed faintly surprised by the degree to which the image existed at all. In March 1991, Serge Gainsbourg died. He was 62. Birkin had left him a decade earlier, but he was still one of the defining presences of her life, artistically, emotionally, historically. Reuters notes that after the breakup he continued to write for her, and she remained close to him until the end. That closeness mattered because it transformed what might otherwise have become a clean narrative. She was never simply the woman who escaped Serge Gainsbourg. She was the woman who loved him, left him, survived him, and then carried him forward through music after death made reconciliation impossible. Birkin continued performing his songs for years, often in new arrangements, turning material once associated with scandal and seduction into something older, sadder, and more spacious. It was one of the great acts of emotional translation in modern popular music. She took work born in youth and made it survivable in maturity. There is a temptation to say that Serge's death closed a chapter. It did, in one sense. But grief does not obey chapter endings. It lingers as atmosphere, as habit, as memory built into the body. Birkin's later work was full of that kind of afterlife, the persistence of what has been lost. If she had stopped there, it would already have been a life marked by unusual emotional intensity. But the deepest wound was still ahead of her, and it would come not through romance, not through legend, not through a man who had shaped public culture, but through a daughter whose death could not be transformed into myth, no matter how famous the family around it was. Kate Barry was Jane Birkin's eldest daughter, born in London in 1967 from her marriage to John Barry. She grew up partly inside one of the most unusual households imaginable, first as the child of a famous British composer and actress, then in France inside the orbit of Serge Gainsbourg and the bohemian, artistic, emotionally turbulent world around him. But Kate was not just the child of famous parents. She became a photographer in her own right, publishing in major magazines and establishing a serious career behind the camera. The Guardian reported that she preferred being behind the scenes and wanted to be known for her own work, rather than merely for her family. There is something poignant in that ambition, because every child born into a dynasty of attention eventually confronts the same question: how do you become visible on your own terms when your surname has already entered the room before you? Kate answered it, at least professionally, through images. But Kate Barry also struggled for years with addiction and depression. According to The Guardian, she had battled drug and alcohol dependency and later founded a free treatment center for addicts in France. That detail matters because it reveals the same instinct that surfaced in Jane's life as well, the urge to turn private suffering into something usable for others. Yet private suffering does not always become manageable simply because one understands it. In December 2013, Kate Barry died after falling from the window of her fourth-floor Paris apartment. She was 46. The apartment was locked from the inside. Antidepressants were reportedly found. An investigation was opened. What remained, above all, was the unbearable fact itself. Birkin, who had spent decades living in public, now had to endure the most private devastation imaginable, while the world knew her name well enough to notice. Whatever else happened in the years that followed, there was a before and after to her life now, and Kate's death was the line between them. Many artists mine sadness. Far fewer allow grief to strip away performance so thoroughly that what remains feels almost indecently raw. In 2020, Jane Birkin released Oh, Pardon to Dorme, her last album of new songs. The Barbican described it as steeped in piano, strings and cinematic tension, and explicitly connected it to the death of Kate. Barbican herself said she did not know how else to make it, except honestly. That statement tells you a great deal about who she had become by then. In youth, she had often been a vessel for other people's compositions, Gainsbourg's songs, other directors' visions, the public's projections. In later life, pain pushed her toward authorship. The album grew partly from an earlier play she had written, but under the pressure of bereavement, it became something more naked, a work concerned with insomnia, memory, accusation, absence, and the terrible persistence of the dead in the minds of the living. What is striking about Oh, Pardon to Dorme is not simply that it is sad, but that it refuses consolation. It does not behave like a healing narrative. It behaves like someone sitting awake in the night, unable to reorder what has happened into something acceptable. That is why it stands as one of the most moving late works of her career. It was not built out of nostalgia for youth, nor out of the safe self-mythologizing that late fame often encourages. It was built out of damage, and yet even there, even in songs shadowed by Kate's death, you hear Birkin's lifelong quality, a refusal to harden completely. The voice remains delicate, almost translucent, but the delicacy now carries age, history, and endurance. The girl in Je t'aime, moi non plus, had become an older woman singing from the far side of loss, and the result was more devastating than scandal had ever been. In 2021, Serge Gainsbourg brought another deeply personal work into the world, Jane by Charlotte, a documentary centered on her mother. Writers reported that the project emerged partly from Charlotte's desire to get closer to Birkin and to explore a reserve between them. That is such a precise and quietly painful phrase, a reserve between them. Because love in this family was never absent, but it was often complicated by distance, history, fame, and the strange distortions that happen when private life is also cultural mythology. The film premiered at Cannes and turned the camera not toward the old legend of Jane and Serge, but toward a more fragile present, a daughter trying to understand her mother while there was still time. Kate's death also hovered over the film, as it hovered over everything by then. It was no longer possible to tell the family story without passing through that absence. What makes the existence of Jane by Charlotte so moving in retrospect is that it now feels like an act of rescue from disappearance. Not rescue in the sense of saving Jane's life, which no film can do, but rescue in the sense of preserving her voice, her hesitations, her aging face, her unfinished emotional conversations. Families are full of deferred questions. The documentary became a place where some of those questions could at last be asked. And because Jane agreed to participate, it offered one final proof of her openness. She did not hide behind the polished mask that fame had every right to give her. She let herself be seen by her daughter in a searching way, even knowing that such seeing is rarely comfortable. Also in 2021, Jane Birkin suffered a mild stroke, forcing cancellations and interrupting a period in which she was still actively performing. Writers noted the stroke in its obituary, and the Barbican later wrote that after recovering she returned to the stage. There is something profoundly characteristic in that sequence. She was injured, she withdrew, she recovered, she came back. By then she was in her 70s, with decades of work behind her, and enough cultural stature to justify retreat if she had wanted it. But Birkin seemed oriented not toward withdrawal, but toward continued presence. She kept singing, kept appearing, kept allowing herself to be in motion. One gets the sense that performance was no longer about conquest or ambition. It was about remaining in contact, with songs, with audiences, with the life still in front of her. This may be part of why her death felt so poignant. She did not seem like a figure who had long ago receded into ceremonial fame. She was still somehow alive inside the present tense. Her last years were marked by illness and fragility, yes, but not by disappearance. Even in reduced health, she remained recognizably herself, lightly ironic, emotionally transparent, and still attached to the work. That resilience makes the ending harder, not easier. When someone has already endured so much, public reinvention, toxic love, artistic pressure, the deaths of people central to her life, the irreversible wound of losing a daughter, there is always a childish part of the imagination that wants endurance itself to become a form of protection. But no life, no matter how iconic, gets to make that bargain. On July 16, 2023, Jane Birkin was found dead at her Paris home. She was 76. Reuters reported that local media said she had been found at home and that France's culture ministry called her a timeless francophone icon. The response was immediate and revealing. President Emmanuel Macron described her as a French icon. Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo called her the most Parisian of the English. These tributes could sound conventional in another case, but with Birkin they carried unusual precision. She had, over more than 5 decades, done something rare, crossed from foreign fascination into national belonging. France had not merely adopted her image, it had accepted her voice, her causes, her vulnerability, and even her accent as part of itself. There is something almost novelistic in the fact that the woman who arrived as a young English actress in the late 1960s ended her life as one of France's most beloved cultural figures. She had not erased where she came from. That was never her gift. Her gift was that she remained recognizably English while becoming emotionally legible to France in a way few outsiders ever do. She did not become French by mimicry. She became French by devotion to the language, to the art, to the public life of the country, to the people she loved there, and to the work she continued to make inside it. When she died, the grief in France had the intimacy of losing someone who belonged not to history in the abstract, but to ordinary memory. Her funeral took place at Saint Roch Church in Paris on July 24, 2023. Reuters reported that hundreds of fans gathered outside, while family, film legends, and musicians gathered within. Charlotte Gainsbourg spoke of the vacuum her mother was leaving behind, calling her not only my mother but our mother. Lou Dollion thanked her for not being ordinary and reasonable. Those are beautiful, revealing words. Not ordinary. Not reasonable. Jane Birkin's life had never obeyed the logic of reasonableness. It had followed the logic of feeling, sometimes to joy, sometimes to transformation, sometimes to heartbreak. The city heard her songs through speakers, and mourners lined the streets holding signs that read Jane forever. Public grief can be performative, but sometimes it is also true. In this case it was true, and perhaps that is the final shape of her story. Not a handbag, not a scandal, not even a love affair, though all of those remain attached to her name. The deeper story is of a woman who stayed permeable. She did not seal herself off from damage. She did not protect herself by becoming colder, more ironic, more distant, or less available to sorrow. She kept loving people whose losses marked her. She kept making art after grief. She kept speaking publicly in a way that let the world see the tremor as well as the glamour. That openness gave her unusual beauty in life, and it gives her unusual gravity in memory. So yes, history will continue to say Jane Birkin inspired a bag. It will continue to replay J Tam, moi non plus. It will continue to show the photographs, the fringe, the basket, the disheveled elegance, the impossible cool. But none of that is enough. Jane Birkin was more moving than fashionable, more enduring than stylish, and more serious than the mythology that first surrounded her. She was a mother of 3 daughters, Kate Barry, Charlotte Gainsbourg, and Lou Dollion, each of whom carried some part of her creative inheritance into another generation. She was an actress with a long, substantial career in French cinema. She was a singer who transformed from muse into author of her own late grief. She was an activist who used public affection for causes larger than herself, and she was, perhaps above all, a woman who remained astonishingly human while the world kept trying to turn her into a symbol. Maybe that is why her story still hurts. Because beneath the legend there is a pattern many people recognize too well: the longing to be loved completely, the decision to stay longer than one should, the effort to build a self after love has rearranged it, the unbearable shock of losing a child, the strange duty of carrying on after the people who defined your life are gone. Jane Birkin made all of that visible without making it cheap. She let sorrow remain sorrow, she let tenderness remain strength, and in the end, that is what survives her most powerfully. Not just the image of the girl everyone wanted to look at, but the memory of the woman who kept feeling deeply in a world that rewards distance, and who, because of that, left behind something rarer than glamour. She left behind truth.